be speaking to England, although more than 90% of all HIV in the UK is in England. So this doesn't apply to the majority of people with HIV in my region. So as background, as I'm sure you all know, all HIV care and treatment is free at the point of access for anybody in England. Now, in 2015-16, NHS England spent £17 billion on drugs, and that's a 30% increase compared to the last 5 years. Now, in England, more than 3/4 of all prescriptions, this is across all disease areas, more than 3/4 of all prescriptions are for generic medication. That's the standard. But until fairly recently, that hadn't really applied to HIV, because it's only in more recent years that we've had the availability of generic versions of drugs that we are still using. So on that basis, and the fact that the HIV drug spend was going up, so in 2015-16, HIV drugs alone accounted for 430 million of our drug spend. Now, as a proportion of 17 billion, that's actually relatively small. But in terms of cost per patient per year, it's significantly higher than other long-term conditions, and we have to effectively compete with other long-term conditions for the same limited pot of money. So to put it in context, treating HIV typically costs between £5,000 and £6,000 per year. If we compare that to diabetes in England, that costs £300 to £400 a year. So we are under pressure to bring our drug prescribing costs down. So on that basis, now one thing to point out is different conditions in England are commissioned differently. The HIV comes under national commissioning, which means at national level, NHS England makes the decisions about which drugs we use and how. So as part of that, with generics becoming available, and it's particularly generic abacavir and imipidine, generic nevirapine prolonged release, and generic efavirenz, that drove a discussion between NHS England and the CRG. Now, the CRG is a clinical reference group, and what that is, and this applies to various specialised conditions, including HIV, is a group of stakeholders, which includes clinicians, community representatives, commissioners, and representatives from various national societies, including the British HIV Association. And we all get together and work with NHS England to come up with plans that save money in a way that's acceptable, hopefully, to us all. So as part of that, we came up with a menu of drug switches. And that was a set of drug switches, generic abacavir, imipidine, nevirapine, prolonged release, and efavirenz, as I've mentioned, with targets. And none of the targets were 100%. But this menu was created, and the results were, in 2016-17, we saved almost £9 million on those 3 drug switches alone. That equates to a 2% decline in drug spend in a year that we saw about a 5% increase in the number of people receiving treatment, so it was really quite significant. Now, there are a number of things that make it easier for us to do this. I think firstly, the situation in different European countries is very, very different, and in the UK it's actually more straightforward for generic companies to gain approval and authorisation. So we actually have the highest rate of generics use in Europe, but also amongst the lowest drug prices in Europe. The fact we have national commissioning helps. We have increasingly restrictive policies related to new drugs. So as new drugs become available, NHS England writes policies that increasingly are limiting their use to those most clinically in need to help preserve the market for generics use. I can't underestimate the importance of community engagement. Our community groups and representatives and peer support workers have been absolutely invaluable, not only in deciding the changes, but also supporting and helping people accept those changes. But also the fact that targets aren't 100%. Nobody is forced to switch from 1 pill to 2 or 3. So ultimately, we've seen significant savings from just a fairly small proportion of market share from those drugs. And through the use of national policies, community engagement, and also cost-based regional guidelines, we hope to preserve the market to ensure we can continue to switch people to clinically appropriate regimens as more generics become available. Thank you.